So I bought the Vulcan 2, paid $60 customs for them, and after seeing the graph, I was about to crash out because look at that scoop. Now luckily I controlled myself because after listening to it a bit more, it's actually not bad and dare I say, nice? But first let's talk about the scoop. For those who don't know what a scoop is, usually a scoop at around 150 Hz to 200 will usually kill the rhythmic section because it pulls back the mid bass, which is, the factor for intensity, slam, no way, and engagement for the drums, bass guitars, woodwind saxes, as well as, making male artists not sound thin. So basically when this happens, genres like hip hop, rap, R&B, EDM, and even rock can sound a bit too anemic, a bit too pushed back, a bit like boring almost, unnaturally thin when it comes to the camera because of the scoop, and just unenjoyable in general. However, the Vulcan 2 kind of makes the scoop work. Now, I'm not saying I recommend these for tracks that need any sort of sub bass like EDM, hip hop, rap, because just look at it, there is no sub bass. But when it comes to like rock, R&B, slower stuff, things that doesn't need that much sub bass, it actually sounds good. Artists like SZA, Cali Urchis, Phineas, Frank Ocean, the Mariahs, they all sound surprisingly clear, clean, very musical, very enjoyable on these. The Vulcan 2's overall tonality is balanced, it's neutral, but it is vocal centric, very clean and clear when it comes to vocal presentation with a slight bite to the notes. But back to the scoop, the reason why I think the scoop doesn't sound, completely, unlistenable, thin and shouty is because of mainly two things on the Vulcan 2. Number one, the upper mids is tamer than Harman or the Variations, which is known for some shoutiness and thinness because there's just too much gain in the vocals for the amount of lower mids that it has. And number two, the lower mids, not mid bass, the lower mids on the Vulcan 2 past 150 200 Hz is pretty filled in, and the elevation overall is very gradual and not like a sudden shoot to the peak. And the reason why the elevation is important is because it dictates the amount of contrast you perceive in the sound, and that affects how obvious the scoop is and how shouty the overall sound is. For example, a peak at 3K in comparison to the 150 Hz, 200 Hz mark will create a bigger perception of change because the change in elevation is just bigger than like a slow gradual increase. Using Harman 2019 as an example, even though it doesn't have a scoop and should sound less thin in theory, it actually feels a little bit more hollow and shouty than the Vulcan 2 because if we measure the highest point at 3K on Harman to its lowest point in the mid bass, there's actually a total of 10 dBs of sound difference in contrast. Now compare that to the Vulcan 2, which only has a 7 dBs of difference if we measure it from the peak to the mid bass. The contrast is just less obvious. So even though the Vulcan 2 does look worse on paper because of the scoop, the actual perception is less dramatic, less jarring because there's a smaller contrast and change. But that's not all, because the lower mids on the Vulcan 2 is more filled in than normal, not the mid bass, the lower mids, and it helps the no way from being overly thin. And then sprinkle on top a tamer upper mids and treble, you get a set that looks really bad on paper, but actually sounds pretty decent with multiple genres, which we'll talk about later. Now, with that said, this doesn't mean the Vulcan 2 is perfectly balanced because it's not an all-rounder for a very obvious reason. It's sub bass, or should I say the lack of sub bass. And I understand why they had to remove some of the sub bass, because if you have that much lower mids and also a sub bass boost on top, then the sound is going to be just too warm, too thick. And because the vocals are already tame, on the tamer side, this is going to ruin the mid-range vocal focus, neutral kind of sound that they're going for on the Vulcan 2. The second reason is if they did boost the sub bass but still wanted to keep the original sound with the fuller lower mids and great separation in the low end and that neutral kind of sound, then you're going to have to create a scoop by default. Because if you don't have some space to separate the lower mids from the sub bass, then it's just gonna sound too warm, too muddy, bad any separation, and layering defeats the purpose of a neutral tonality on the Vulcan 2. Which is why if they did boost the sub bass more, the scoop will just become more obvious as it gets tighter and more squished in, because they do still need to separate the sub bass and the mid bass from the lower mids and mid range, which just creates a bigger scoop and more obvious any thinness. Now obviously if they didn't care about creating a neutral or vocal centric sound, like if they're going for like a warmer sound, then obviously they can just fill in the mid bass, right? But for the tuning the Vulcan 2 is going for some of the sub bass will have to go. This is why I don't recommend the Vulcan 2s for hip hop, EDM, rap, or even watching movies, because you do need quite a bit of sub bass for those. And they're just not that much sub bass. It lacks the energy, the rumble, the slam, the engagement. There's also like no hype, and the vocals now can sound a little bit too forward and shouty without the extra low end to kind of balance it out. So overall, the Vulcan 2 just sounds not very enjoyable when it comes to low stuff. However, I did enjoy these when it came to indie, rock, ballad, slower stuff, acoustics, because those genres usually don't have much sub bass anyway, so you're not gonna miss the lack of sub bass. And as a result of the instrument choice on those genres, the Vulcan 2 just sounds like natural in its habitat, very clean, clear, extended, a good neutral vocal set for those genres. Because normally without the extra lower mids from 200 to 800, it's gonna sound a bit thin with the lack of sub bass and just low end, right? But because the 200 to 800 is boosted a bit more, it really carries the note weight from just floating away and becoming too thin, since I didn't notice much, thinness or like bad timbre when it came to the vocals on those like slower genres that I mentioned before. Now, when it comes to the technical performance, the Vulcan 2 is nicely layered, it's well separated, the transients have a slight sharpness in the attack and a slight bite to the notes. And it's not the smoothest sounding IEM, it does have some contrast in the vocals, which is a good thing. It's a little bit more dynamic than something smoother like the EM6L. The detail is good, the resolution is good. I would say it's around the DUSK level or a little bit less, like around that, but just with less sub bass and no treble sizzle. The Vulcan 2 is not going to be a value pick or very high performing when it comes to the tech for the price. It's not super airy or like, very amazing in the micro details, but the treble is extended enough. It's not dark. It has a decent sense of space. Cymbal crashes aren't super airy, they're not super extended in the decay, but it sounds natural, and there's enough in the detail and the treble to not take away the focus from the mid-range and the vocals. Scaling wise, when it comes to indie, acoustic, ballads, the Vulcan 2 scales pretty decent at around 75 to 80 dBs on those, a little bit lower for more energetic rock and R&B stuff, but overall you can crank these a little bit more because of the upper mids cut and not the over boosted treble. The only genres that it doesn't scale too well on is with more energetic stuff like J-pop, K-pop, EDM, rap, some hip-hop, because the sub-bass gimp does hurt the balance a bit, and it just pushes your focus more onto the vocals and the electronic elements, which is often a little bit over boosted when it comes to those genres, a little bit shouty in those tracks. So for those, we're looking at a mid-volume listen at around like 60-65 dBs or so. Personally, I wouldn't recommend listening to them at lower volumes around 60 dBs because it just sounds a bit dead. Like it just sounds a bit lifeless due to the tamer upper mids, tamer treble, and then like a gimp in the sub bass and the low end, right? The Vulcan 2 really starts to come alive with a little bit more scaling on songs like Bon Iver, Mitski, Lana Del Rey. Now, tip-wise, I would recommend anything that helps the low-end slams a bit harder, like the Velveted Venus, the Spin Fits, Final E, As La Cenas. Those are all gonna help the, bring more energy and life to the sound for obvious reasons, because the Vulcan 2 just has no sub bass if you need some sub bass, right? So those do help a little bit when it comes to just the overall authority and impact. As for some comparisons compared to some other neutral vocal sets like the P50 and the Studio 4, the Vulcan 2 is overall just less all-rounded. It doesn't have that much low end, it doesn't have as much treble and upper mids as well compared to those. So if you're looking for a more, complete and traditional listen at mid volume, those would all be better. But the Vulcan 2 does scale a little bit better than them, and the vocals are a little bit more in focus because of the scaling and because the treble and the sub bass is pulled back more. In terms of the vocal enjoyment, I would put them around the same as the P50, the Studio 4s, but just falls short when it comes to tracks that needs a little more sub bass because it doesn't have any. So it's overall less flexible, but scales a little bit better, and a little bit more vocal centric, a little cleaner because it doesn't have as much sub bass and treble to get in the way of the vocals. If your library doesn't need that much sub bass and you like cranking up the vocals, then you can get away with the less sub bass from the Vulcan 2. It actually sounds cleaner in the vocal extension because it doesn't have that much of the other stuff, right? So it does work well as a specialty set for that, but just not a great all-rounder that I can recommend for anyone looking for some set that can just like play everything. Now versus the original Vulcan, that's also a neutral set like the Vulcan 2, but the main difference is that the OG is more of a mid-volume set. It's better all around it, it's more filled in the low end, but it won't scale as well because the AK peak is more noticeable than the Vulcan 2. Both have a clean sound, but the Vulcan 2 is going to be slightly more vocal centric, whereas the OG Vulcan is more of your, safe, neutral kind of monitor like listen. Since you can't get the original Vulcans anymore, if you're looking for a neutral kind of set, then you're better off with something like the P50s or the Studio 4s, which are just the all-rounder neutral kind of sound. Then versus the DUSK, PILGRIM, and CANON Pro, those were all going to be more all-rounded, more flexible. Most people are going to like those three better overall. They're just better balanced, more complete for other genres like hip-hop and EDM, for example, are going to be better on those, even though I wouldn't really recommend them for hip-hop anyways, but they are more complete since you get a bit of everything, a little bit more. The Vulcan 2 on the other hand is more specialized in the vocals, it's more forward, more neutral, scales better, around the same tech wise, but it will be a hit or miss depending on your library since again it's a specialty set, more neutral, more vocal focused. Then lastly, compared to some more bass centric IEMs like the Estrella, Hype 4, T Pros, even the Astros, Odysseys, those are just gonna sound more engaging, more textured, and the low end fuller, funner, punchier, slams harder. Those are going to be the better pick when it comes to hip-hop, rap, R&B, EDM, and even pop. They are the better all-rounder bassy sets if that's what you're looking for. And obviously this is not a bass headset by any means, so if you're looking for a bass head, get the Martillos, the Punch, the Deuce, those are all going to be better. Even the Legatos at $100 are going to be better than this when it comes to pure bass head enjoyment. So in conclusion, even though the Vulcan 2 isn't as bad as it looks on the graph, in fact, it's actually pretty decent with the right library. However, given the price, if you want a vocal-centric set at around $360, I would either just get the Volume S for male vocals or the ARCANIS overall for that unique bite and goosebump factor. Because not only are those two going to be better all-rounded since they just have more low end, they're more complete in the extension, they're going to work better for more genres, but they also do what the Vulcan 2 does, which is vocals and scaling, but just a little bit better. For example, the Volume S is both fuller and more powerful when it comes to male vocals. It's a little bit thicker, a little bit huskier. It sounds more enjoyable if you're looking for just male vocals. It has that manliness, quote unquote, to it. And also scale is pretty good as well, right? And as for the ARCANIS, it also has the vocal centric and slight vocal contrast sound like the Vulcan 2, but it just takes the bite and the immersion to a whole nother level. It's one of my favorite under $1,000 for a reason. This is more neutral, whereas the ARCANIS has more of a special sauce. So unless you specifically want a neutral vocal centric set with no bass, the Vulcan 2 is a pass for most people at its retail price of $360 because there are just too many good IEMs at that price. And since this is a niche set, it is very hard to recommend. Maybe at around $200 if you can get on sale for that as a specialty set, I would say it's a pretty good side grade to the P50s and some other stuff at around $200. But at $360, I do think it is a little bit expensive, even though I do like how it sounds. But aside from that, I hope you found this review helpful. Interesting set from DUNU to say the least. I mean, at least it's not another Harman or the Brain Damage, so good start, I guess, but it is a bit harder to recommend at $360. If you can get it on sale for much cheaper, give it a shot. But yeah, anyways, thanks for watching, guys, and make sure you check out the giveaway if you haven't already, and I'll see everyone in the next one.
Special thanks to Dom Q, Rark's Cat, Mystic Spoon Attack, B. Urak, Discus Goddess, Walker Standard, Patrick, User, Oh Really, Contain Guava Juice Gains, Mr. Gorillas, Polly J, Giseng Young, Christopher Jackson, Henry Claudia, Son of a Horse, 777ZK, Wizard, Obi, Trouble Well Extended, Freakalicious, Ricardo, Tapis R, Choco Norris, Tomat, Shrimp Backleet, FKSRG, Cousin Fat Fat, Julius Philip, Dead Riddle, Bilha, Ardmore, Rhythm, Parham, Gerbilis, Nicholas, Jasper, Brandon, Addy, Syracuse, Harder to Play, Wayu, Michael, Denir, Jacob, and Venetius. Thank you guys so much for the support.